A hobby fisherman was enjoying a peaceful day on his local lake when his fishing rod bent dramatically. After a tough fight, he finally reeled in a large fish, but as he pulled it from the water, his excitement instantly turned to revulsion and horror. A grotesque, massive lump was growing from the side of the fish's neck. But this wasn't just one sick fish. It was the first, terrifying symptom of a hidden, invisible poison that had been silently seeping into the lake for months. A man-made plague that had turned this peaceful fishing spot into a toxic trap. But before we start our story, smash that like button, make sure you're subscribed, and hit that notifications bell so you won't miss any of our new, incredible stories. To understand the full, horrifying scope of this discovery, we must first understand the fragile and interconnected world of a freshwater lake. A lake is not just a body of water. It is a complex, living ecosystem, a delicate web of life. It begins with the microscopic algae and phytoplankton, which are consumed by tiny insects and zooplankton. These, in turn, are eaten by small minnows and baitfish. And at the top of this food chain are the apex predators, the large sport fish like the largemouth bass. Each link in this chain is dependent on the others. But this interconnectedness also makes the entire system incredibly vulnerable to a process known as bioaccumulation. When a persistent, toxic chemical enters the water, it doesn't just dilute and disappear. It is absorbed by the smallest organisms at the bottom of the food chain. When those organisms are eaten, the toxin is passed up to the next level, becoming more and more concentrated in the fatty tissues of the animals at each step. This means that a large predator at the top, like the base in our story, can accumulate a dose of poison that is thousands or even millions of times more concentrated than the level in the water itself. The top predators become the ultimate reservoirs for the lake's most dangerous secrets. One of the most notorious and dangerous of these hidden poisons is a class of industrial chemicals known as polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. For decades, from the 1930s to the 1970s, PCBs were an industrial wonder. They were used in hundreds of products, from electrical transformers and capacitors to paints and plastics. But we now know that PCBs are also one of the most toxic and environmentally persistent chemicals ever created. They do not break down easily in nature, and they are a potent carcinogen, a substance that is known to cause aggressive cancers. The production of PCBs was banned in the United States in 1979, and their disposal is now heavily regulated. But a legacy of these forever chemicals still haunts our landscape, often hidden in old industrial sites, waiting for a moment of carelessness to escape back into the environment. It was this invisible, man-made poison that was about to be discovered by a lone fisherman. Our story's protagonist, a man we'll call David, was a lifelong fishing enthusiast from Michigan. For him, fishing was more than a hobby. It was a form of meditation, a way to connect with the quiet beauty of the natural world. On a calm summer afternoon, he was out on his favorite local lake, a beautiful body of water known for its healthy population of largemouth bass. Suddenly, he got a strong bite. After a thrilling battle, he finally reeled in his catch. As he lifted the large bass out of the water, he saw the lump. It was a massive, ugly, tumorous growth on the fish's neck. In all his years of fishing, he had never seen anything like it. Shocked and disgusted, he placed the fish in his cooler, his day of peaceful fishing now tainted by the disturbing sight. He tried to put it out of his mind, but a short time later, he caught another bass, and it had a similar, though smaller, grotesque growth, and then a third. His heart sank. This was not a freak occurrence. This was an epidemic. There was a deep sickness in this lake, and he had just pulled the first horrifying evidence to the surface. Concerned and deeply unsettled, David contacted a friend of his who worked as a freshwater biologist for the state. He described what he had found, and the biologist's interest was immediately piqued. They agreed to meet the next day. The biologist arrived with a field testing kit and a professional necropsy set. In David's garage, they laid one of the tumor-ridden fish on a clean surface. The biologist carefully examined the large lump, his professional demeanor growing more and more grim. He took his scalpel and made the first careful incision into the growth. As he cut through the tissue, he knew instantly what he was looking at. This was not a parasite or an infection. It was a classic, aggressive, malignant carcinoma, a cancerous tumor. The sight was so disturbing and the implications so serious, and told him they needed to call the authorities immediately. The biologist's urgent and serious tone sent a chill down David's spine. This was no longer a strange natural curiosity. It was a potential public health emergency. The authorities were called immediately, and what had started as a quiet fishing trip quickly escalated into a full-scale environmental investigation. A team of scientists from the state's Department of Environmental Quality arrived at the lake the next morning. They cordoned off the area and began a systematic collection of samples. They took water from different depths, they took core samples of the thick sediment from the lake bed, and they collected more fish, all of which showed the same horrifying tumorous growths. The samples were rushed to the state's main toxicology laboratory for analysis. While they waited for the results, the lake, which had always been a place of peace and recreation for the local community, now seemed sinister, its calm surface hiding a deadly secret. When the lab results came back a few days later, they confirmed the biologist's worst fears, and then some. The fish tissues and the lake sediment were saturated with dangerously high levels of a specific, highly toxic, and long-banned industrial chemical, polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. The scientists now had their culprit. The grotesque cancers in the fish were a direct and undeniable result of chronic PCB poisoning. The investigation now shifted from a scientific mystery to a criminal one. The production of PCBs had been banned in the United States since 1979. So how had this forever chemical ended up in such high concentrations in a quiet, recreational lake? The investigators began a process of environmental detective work. They knew the PCBs had to be coming from a specific, concentrated source, not just general runoff. They started to trace the network of small streams and groundwater flows that fed into the lake. Using historical maps and old property records, they identified all the industrial sites that had ever operated in the lake's watershed over the past 70 years. The trail eventually led them to a large, overgrown, and forgotten piece of property a few miles upstream from the lake. Decades ago, it had been the site of a factory that manufactured electrical components. The factory had gone out of business in the early 1980s, and the property had sat abandoned and derelict ever since. They found it. Tucked away in a patch of thick, overgrown brush at the back of the property was a series of large, rusting 55-gallon drums, half buried in the soil. They were leaking a thick, oily substance into the ground, a substance that was slowly but surely seeping into the groundwater and making its way into the creek that fed directly into David's fishing lake. The lab tests confirmed it. These leaking barrels were the source, a toxic legacy that had been silently poisoning the ecosystem for nearly 40 years. A recent heavy rainfall had likely caused a more significant leak, which had finally pushed the concentration of PCBs in the lake to a tipping point, causing the sudden and horrifying epidemic of cancer in the fish. The aftermath of the discovery was swift and serious. The lake was immediately closed to all fishing, boating, and swimming, and a public health advisory was issued to the entire community. What followed was a massive, multi-million-dollar and years-long environmental cleanup operation funded by the state's Superfund program. Crews in hazmat suits had to remove the leaking barrels and tons of contaminated soil from the old factory site. The lake itself had to be dredged to remove the toxic sediment from the bottom, a long and difficult process to restore the health of the fragile ecosystem. The owners of the now-defunct corporation that had abandoned the barrels were tracked down, and they faced serious criminal charges and massive fines for their environmental crimes. The story of the fisherman and the sick fish is a powerful and sobering reminder of the hidden dangers that can lurk just beneath the surface of our most beautiful and peaceful landscapes. It is a story about how the careless and greedy mistakes of the past can resurface decades later to haunt the present. But it is also a story of a quiet hero, David, the humble fisherman, who, out of a simple sense of right and wrong, refused to ignore a sign that the natural world was in pain. His single, concerned phone call triggered a chain of events that uncovered a massive environmental crime, brought the polluters to justice, and saved his community's beloved lake from a silent, invisible, and deadly poison.